Good afternoon. I am Mark Cohn from Spirent and the moderator for this featured panel discussion on the evolution of managed security services. Like some on this panel, and I'm sure in the audience, I've been involved in the open networking movement since its inception and the beginning of the Layer 123 World Congress events, and have witnessed how network security has evolved from niche to mainstream. The cloud is revamping every aspect of the telecommunications industry, and managed security is no different. As the enterprise has been dramatically evolving, accelerated by the COVID crisis, enterprise security is transitioning from protecting the perimeter to protecting users, applications, and data. In our panel discussion this afternoon, our experts will be sharing their unique perspectives on how these trends influencing the managed security services increasingly demanded by large enterprise, government, and other verticals. Our panelists include a senior executive of a global CSP MSP who's been at the forefront of the telecommunications digital transformation, the GM of a security business for the leader in communications test technology, a technology and visionary driving cloud strategy for a Pan-African carrier, and a leading industry analyst and veteran of multiple security startups. Panelists are also participating in relevant standardization activities, which we will be addressing during this panel. And as this is a pre-recorded session, we will not be able to take your questions live, but encourage you to email them so that we can respond after the session. But before getting started, I wanted to invite each of the panelists to introduce themselves and share their interest in cloud-based managed security services. So Devesh, we'll start with you.
Hi there. Thank you, Mark. First of all, I would like to say I'm very glad to be part of this panel, and I hope to learn from my fellow panelists here. I'm no expert on security, but I'll just briefly introduce myself. I am the Vice President of Technologies and Sales Operations at PCCW Global. We are a global telecommunication provider. We provide fixed line, IP, MPLS, and SD-WAN services. I'm also the co-chair for the MEF Test and Certification Committee, and we're working towards drafting standards for carrier Ethernet, SD-WAN, and now of late we're working on standardization of security services over SD-WAN. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Mark. It's good to be here as well. My name is Dave Larson. I am the General Manager of the Security Solutions business at Spirent Communications. I've been in industry for almost 30 years now, spanning both startup technologies and the emerging Ethernet space, as well as data security spanning VPN gateways, next-gen firewall, intrusion prevention, DDoS mitigation, and lately cloud architectural security considerations. I'm happy to be here and happy to join this discussion.
Thank you, Dave. Nico?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone. It's a great honor to be here and join this and sharing my experience in our very unique region of the world. I'm Nico Walters. I head up global innovation and information here at CMC Networks. We're the largest Pan-African MPLS and Ethernet provider at the moment, but we also do work around SD-WAN, SASE, and the like. As part of MEF, I'm a member at the Commercial Businesses Committee and the Digital Services Committee, where I co-edit the new standard on Zero Trust, and obviously work on SASE and MEF SD-WAN as well.
Thank you, Nico. We'll be revisiting that in a few moments. And then Roy.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity here. I am Roy Chua. I'm the principal and founder of EvitThink, a research and analysis service, and been in the networking field for a long time now. Started my career at Cisco writing ATM firmware. Now, along the way, done a couple of things, as Mark indicated, worked in started a couple of security companies, actually. And in security, we currently cover security within the infrastructure for telcos with 4G, 5G, and IoT, as well as obviously SD-WAN and SASE, sort of the hot topic of the day. And the interesting thing is we have actually Spirent on the panel, and the Spirent layer 4 to 7, one of the layer 4 to 7 product lines, the Avalanche, actually was my product line. I was on the founding team of the company that was subsequently acquired by Spirent. And so that product, was launched about 2000. And I think the last 20 years has tested just about every security product out there is. DDoS mitigation, pick your favorite. So it's interesting to be back in with a bunch of Spirent guys on the panel. So appreciate it.
Well, Roy, you predate Dave and I by a long time, so let's just put it
That's
that
right.
way.
I'm prehistoric. How's that?
You just look so young. So anyhow, the way the panel is going to be laid out for everyone is that first I'm just going to pose a question that everybody's going to have a chance to answer just to set some context. And then I've selected some individual questions that I'll be directing to each of the panelists. So let's just move into it. The first question is that the cloud is offering obviously tremendous opportunity, but complexity as well. So I'd like to ask the panelists to share their thoughts on how the cloud has altered the threat landscape that's confronting your organization and your customers. What's the problem that each of you are trying to solve when it comes to cloud-based managed security? So Roy, why don't we just continue with you just to set some context as our sole industry analyst?
Yeah, so certainly the cloud has added one more space to keep secure. I think the cloud's a mixed blessing in a way. The cloud in some ways represents obviously a lot of extra compute out there that you can use or rent as you see fit for an enterprise or even a service provider, if you will. But it also represents a new arena in which they have to add security, right? And so the historical visibility controls that they put in place, or enterprises have sought to put in place between campus networks, their own data centers, the WAN, branches, mobile users, right, just got more complicated by adding one more region, the cloud, of which they have limited control over the underlying infrastructure, right, but have to work within the bounds of what the cloud providers have given them. And the fact that it's elastic and changing makes it a lot more complicated. And now you have multi-clouds to secure. And so that there is definitely a significant challenge on that part to secure the clouds. If we've gotten better over the years, right? We don't leave S3 buckets open as maybe we still do, but hopefully we don't, for example. And the vendors have stepped up to try to improve cloud security. But it's both I think it's a mixed blessing, because on the other hand, you would hope that the cloud providers can run security better than you can, given the scale of operations that they run. And usually they do, except when they don't. So just my perspective.
All right, thank you. Devesh, I think we'll go to you next to get a broader global operator's perspective.
Okay. So my sense of this is, I think I agree with what Roy is saying, that, provides enterprises, we're fronting with them day in, day out. We provide them connectivity services, and we also have security services that we're offering. Now, increasingly what's happening is the applications are moving into cloud. And what it does is basically, instead of having a full control over your application and hardware and software from an enterprise customer's perspective, now you are in a position where you're kind of in a shared responsibility. So you have part of the control over your network, but then there is a part which is actually residing on a cloud operator's backbone, and you have to let go a little bit of your control based on the visibility, the level of visibility that you can get on resources on the cloud. I think that's what Roy was also mentioning. And so it's difficult to see from a security standpoint, who owns the security of the entire end-to-end solution. Is it the MSP in the middle? Is it the enterprises, or is it the cloud service providers, right? And I would say that I think probably MSPs are in a good position to take that front end and deliver services which are fully compatible and secure end to end, because they can see the entire network. They can also see the cloud end of it. For example, there would be other MSPs also, but PCCW Global has private connections to cloud. And we actually secure access all the way to a public cloud, and we can provide application level security as well on top. So, I mean, this is just one instance, but other than that, another component that kind of comes up in between is the cloud to cloud data exchange, where you have maybe instead of having a human being access an application, it's an API which is accessing. Now you're talking about endpoint security, and you need to not only just have a perimeter security where you have once enabled an API you can access, but you would have to have monitoring and control over what is being accessed by the API, how frequently is it being accessed. All these questions are getting raised now because we're in a different dynamics. We are into an environment where machine-to-machine applications are running. You have human beings accessing as well as service accounts being set up on the cloud environment. So that complicates the amount of information that you can provide and you can access and monitor in a overall solution that is being provided to the enterprise customers. So yeah, I mean, it's a challenging bet, but I think there are solutions out there. SASE is something which is coming together and putting security and security networking and security in a common realm to be able to manage that through a single console. I think that is where we are headed from a service provider or MSP perspective. And I think that's where our customers are looking for us to be heading as well. So that's what I would,
No question, distributed security is on the horizon. Our previous panel discussion addressed that topic. I'm going to ask Nico to share some insights from Africa.
Yeah, so I mean, thanks. In MENA, so Middle East and Africa, where we operate, I think the first thing is to say we have a very unique challenge when it comes to cloud adoption, and that's why it's been lagging a bit, is the fact that we only have 1 or 2 on-ramps in 1 or 2 locations that it's available. So I know the big multinationals, the big enterprises, force the security concept and pushing cloud security in its various forms out. But then the negative part of it is latency and issues of access. Then add on top of it cost. I mean, circuits and links are super expensive in certain regions. So there is an element outside of just the normal security issues and concerns that you have to tackle. But within the security space, when you move your perimeter outside of your campus and data center, like Roy was mentioning, and push that, and I love what you're saying, Mark, and it's a question of not securing the perimeter anymore. It's now securing endpoints, applications, and sort of mobile users. That in itself opens that a whole range of threat vectors that now is a combination of visibility, like Devesh was saying, as well as sort of bring your own device as well. We talk about security in all these forms, but we never look at the commercial impact of cloud and doing all these things. We're pushing people to the cloud during COVID, but organizations haven't necessarily had the chance to upgrade systems to cater for that. So there's a commercial challenge, and to offset that, enterprises have gone this whole bring your own device sort of strategy, which again, how do you now apply security on a device that's not owned by the company itself? So that in itself is another issue outside of the norm, of issues of endpoints and whatnot. I'm just looking at it from a slightly different point of view, but those are some of the sort of the unknown things that you catch as you go along. That I've definitely seen and personally, policies and all these things as well have been drastically changing. So that's all of the things that come along with cloud adoption and the race to cloud. I think that those are some of the edge cases that I just thought I'd mention.
No, I completely agree. I think that there's some common themes here that we're going to hear about the rest of the morning. And actually, we've addressed in other sessions in the conference. So Dave, why don't you talk about it from a technology perspective?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mark. Great comments by all 3 panelists so far. There's not much that I could add in terms of the backdrop. What I'd like to do is try to wrap some of it together. One of the things that's interesting, Nico points out the commercial model aspects, and Roy and Devesh have been pointing out some of the things that are changing from the enterprise or the managed service provider's perspective. All of this is true, and it's really dynamic, and it's rapidly changing, right? As we are forced into new working models from an enterprise perspective, from a COVID work at home perspective, as we try to move into new regions like Africa, as we try to really build a global community and evolve the connectivity of the internet to a more secure model. One of the things that we did well early on was we were able to validate the claims of security solutions. We were able to take and compare them to each other against a very simplistic backdrop. And that backdrop was based on the fact that you could view everything as a device under test. And you could say, hey, I have a firewall, or I have an intrusion prevention system, or I have a secure web gateway or a WAF. And we tested those things against their data sheets, and we were able to demonstrate their efficacy, or in some cases, their lack of efficacy. And over time, we got good at allowing people to get wonderful visibility of their localized edge. Well, as we start to move our applications in a diffuse manner into the cloud, taking advantage of all the elasticity and service ephemerality that exists in that landscape, what we've left behind is the ability to validate anything, all right? One of the comments that was made is that you have to sort of give up a little bit of trust. You're running on somebody else's backbone, and that's true. And the reality is many of those backbones are wonderfully secure. I mean, think about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the number one complaint or barrier for an enterprise to adopt cloud, or in fact, any kind of managed security service, was the fact that they didn't trust it. Today, the number one reason to adopt cloud is because of the security of cloud infrastructure and the fact that enterprises are increasingly challenged to deal with the complexity of the threat landscape. So as people are moving, I don't want to say that they're moving blind, but they've just changed their risk profile and their trust model, and they're accepting the claims of the cloud environment as fact. And I think one of the things that we like to push as part of this conversation, and I know the MEF is also talking about this, is that we have an obligation as a community to build a standardized backdrop that people can use to understand the security posture that they're creating in a very hybrid way. Part of it's private estate, part of it's public estate, part of the function is outsourced to a managed service provider of some form, whether in the security realm or otherwise. And there are efficacy concerns that we need to consider, but there are economic concerns as well. How do you blend your notion of your efficacy, your risk profile, and the economics of the things you're paying for and the application performance that you require of your environment at global scale? These are not simple things, but we as a community, and my panelists and I, are spending a lot of time working with the community to define the ways that we will evaluate security frameworks, security posture, security technologies and standards, APIs, cloud native, and how all of that maps into the legacy environments of the enterprise. Because let's face it, everyone wants to move to cloud, but nobody can move everything to cloud. So we have to be able to have an inclusive perspective of how to organize something that allows folks to have a really strong understanding of what they're doing in their security realm.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the point you're making about how what we're testing, what we're validating, what we're delivering is changing is a huge part of this equation. And on that note, Devesh, PCCW Global has offered a managed security services for a number of years, in many cases working with your partners, but there's been a lot of innovation internally. The question I wanted to come back to you with is, what security challenges are your managed SD-WAN customers seeking to overcome as they're migrating to the cloud? And then, how is PCC, if you can shed some light on how PCCW is addressing these challenges and being able to enable that transition, specifically in that journey because of the many of the issues we've already discussed in their initial question.
Okay. Yeah, so as you rightly pointed out, actually, we have PCCW Global has a security services, and we have security services operation, a SOC operational out of our Greece offices. We provide also an SD-WAN service, which was recently certified as a MEF certified service. Increasingly, I mean, I mentioned, I think initially in our opening note, that customers are looking at end-to-end security. They're not looking just purely standalone or something which is just only endpoint driven or parameter driven. And I'm actually on from the pre-sale side, so I can see that requirements coming in terms of RFPs from customers. We increasingly will have our security experts working hand in hand with our networking experts to address that requirement. So that is at the proposal stage that we will work together. And during the deployment and even after deployment, there are requirements that a customer would come in increasingly and ask us for, where you have a part of this is delivered through the standard networking policies, right? And then there is another part which is actually applicable where you're applying security policies end to end. So I think the trend is that we kind of need to combine these to try and bring them up in a common portfolio and a common front end to the customers. They can manage the entire policy set under one domain instead of having two different domains. So we're actively engaged with our technology providers, and we're working on bringing these along. There are challenges there, but yeah, I mean, I think the standards are only getting drafted as we speak. The issue is that most of the technology vendors have different specs, different standards are in there today. So over the period of time, I think as we see them growing together, you would see services coming in which would cater to both of these requirements. But having said that, I think one critical aspect of this is that the skill sets required for addressing a security requirement for a customer are totally different, and you need to have those within the thresholds of an MSP to be able to offer that kind of service, because it's not just left to a security service operation, that you could actually also gather and provide security services. So I mean, you need to have those skill sets, and actually we're actively working on and getting those networking guys and security folks talk together to provide a bundled solution to the customer.
And I think you're putting your finger on a key point, getting networking and security to be coordinated. I think that's going to be a recurring theme in this area as well. Nico, I'm going to move on to you. So as obviously one of the leading Pan-African carriers, as you pointed out, CMC has been in the midst of a turbulent region that's experienced tremendous growth over the past decade in Africa. But it's a very different kind of geography and economy. So what I wanted you to do is to elaborate something you touched on earlier, which is to talk a little more about what is the state of the cloud in the environment that your customers are operating in, and how are security services having to address the distinct and unique operational and economic and even technology challenges that your customers are facing?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think one of the first things I wanted to say, was we have Africa it's 54 countries, so 54 individual information regulators, 54 possible locations and political regions that in some cases they shut a country down. We've had it recently with Djibouti, they just turn all connectivity off. So that's the inherent issue when it comes to turbulence that you mentioned. When we look at the state of the cloud, we've been fortunate, we operate in 51 of those countries, with full-on POPs and being able to offer these, sort of cloud-esque services over the past 10 years. But I think that the overall state is we're still stuck with a handful of hyperscalers based in South Africa, which means the large part of the continent doesn't have a very low latency sort of connection, I could say, to it. So that's one element. But so what we found is the concept of a hybrid cloud is more prevalent, much more at the moment. So we have regional data centers. We've had massive investment in data centers over the past year or two. More coming. You know, we're talking $2 to $5 billion in certain regions. So the concept of the hyperscale cloud is maybe not so strong, although, you know, the hyperscalers are actively pushing. You know, we are seeing more of them coming onto the continent. But the other idea, the private data centers, the sort of shared carrier neutral data centers where we, as service providers, building out clouds, that's very prevalent in and that's kind of the state of our cloud at the moment. It's very much a private public mix, where, and the concept of sort of regional locations for private clouds or private cloud offerings from service providers like us, embracing this whole MEC concept, the multi-edge compute concept. That's definitely, you know, where we're going. And I think that's just enabled it, growth, massive growth. And I always say Africa is a clean slate when it comes to technology. We don't have 30 or 40 years of legacy in some cases, you know, and that's also enabled us to adopt a lot of newer technologies a lot quicker. You know, 5G, general cloud services, Azure Stack, all of these kinds of things are adopted a lot quicker because we have a cleaner slate. The only problem is the high barrier to entry in our region does obviously set some people off. But if you're willing to take I mean, we've been operating in Africa for 30 years. You know, we've learned our lessons. But yeah, that is the sort of crux of it. Is yes, it's definitely growing and growing very, very fast.
Thank you. And it's fascinating to see the differences. Dave, you lead the Spirent security testing and validation business, which is used to being on the forefront of major technology and network market and architecture shifts like what we're experiencing today with the cloud. How is testing and security assurance evolving to address the challenges that are ushered in by the cloud? And what areas are you prioritizing as you guide the development of your next generation of solutions that you want to offer to our managed service provider customers?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I think, you know, there's a tremendous amount of exciting stuff going on for us to look at, not the least of which is this notion that in the past, a lot of the test capability was performed by very heavyweight, very high performance appliances. And we don't expect that to go away, but it's very difficult to move an appliance around in the cloud. So what has happened, very much like the application landscape for cloud, is that everything's been virtualized, and the ability to operate a test engine in AWS or Azure or GCP or in the private estate, and couple that with high performance engines that run, you know, at 100 gig or above potentially. How do you build out some kind of a test environment? And the thing that's interesting about it is that there's a lot of available ability to work within the community, work within the definition of the APIs that are controlling the infrastructure, work with the vendor community that's defining how do you deal with this problem of a diffuse application environment in a way that you can measure it accurately, you can measure it dynamically. In other words, in the cloud, workloads, cloud functions, virtual machines, or containers, they might last for a minute, they might last for a year, they might last for a few milliseconds. How do you contemplate understanding how to even measure something like that? Moreover, you know, everyone on this panel, I'm sure, will agree, probably the biggest challenge that has occurred, that a shift that's been taking, you know, it's been taking place over the last decade, but I think it's with us here today, is that because of the amount of security breaches, right? Let's face it, it's not a closed secret. Almost every enterprise gets owned at some point in their progression of dealing with their application landscape. Well, the knee-jerk reaction to that, and it's not a bad one, but it has implications for how you secure things, is that we are moving very rapidly to encrypting everything end to end. And when you encrypt everything end to end, it's very, very difficult to make some kind of intermediary assessment of what is going on from an inspection perspective. It used to be that everything was open text, or at least the headers were open text, and at least things were discrete flows and not bundled inside of a tunnel or some kind of a construct like VXLAN in the data center, that you needed a way to extrapolate from that. It was easier. It used to be easier to be able to decide that, oh, that's a voice connection, and that's something that's going to my data backend, and that's a front end connection to some web user. This stuff is not all that obvious anymore. And so there's a necessity to start building into the flows the communication of metadata, so that within the tunnels, or as the tunnels are transiting a global ecosystem of network providers and service providers, it can be understood what the service level associated with that flow is supposed to be. And by using inspection technologies that understand, using heuristics about how the behavior of the flow is taking place, and at every step from inception to its endpoint on the other side, what's going on, all of this visualization and measurement capability is something that it's very early days of how we're able to apply that in a way that both operators and enterprises can make use of that information to make better decisions about how to secure their environment. And for us, it's about getting our technology adopted in places where it provides people a benefit to be able to measure or test or simulate or emulate something, so that they can have a better understanding of how the broader infrastructure will react, either under attack, under congestion, or frankly, under some form of outage that is beyond anyone's control. All of these things need to be taken into consideration, but you can never know how something is going to work unless you test it to the edges of its capability to operate. And so for us, it's about building out that more dynamic, blended, and cloud-native ecosystem of technologies.
And thinking a little broader, it has to be layered on top of all the other testing that's already going to be performed at the virtualization layer, at the interconnection layer, and so forth. Okay, so Roy, I'm going to go in a little bit different direction here. Based on your very broad experience and exposure to a number of activities that are underway and companies, one of the compelling trends that we've observed that's really gained some momentum over the last, I'd say 12 to 18 months, is a lot more partnering and M&A activity, mergers and acquisition activity. And again, from an analyst, with your analyst hat on, based on your engagements with your key customers, what do you think the motivation is that are driving and increasing these alliances? And what do you think we can expect for 2021?
Yeah. So I think, fundamentally, the environment we're in, I think everyone recognizes it is rapidly changing, and the degree of specialization continues to increase. I think that's one of the key things that we are seeing. In that kind of arena, then the tendency to say, look, you have to look at it as a corporation, decide what's core and non-core. And for things that you don't believe are necessarily strategic or valuable, right, to your business, as it were, is to go out and find partners or work with other people to make those things happen, because we can't be experts in all areas. And increasingly, as I think Dave pointed out, is you need to know a lot more, right? And part of it is you just can't hire. It's not even whether you want to or not. You can't even get the stuff, right? Which is why Devesh was talking about using managed services, right? And so I think it's in this arena of sort of globalization, the need for specialization, and the rapid change that's forcing corporations, in effect, to say, look, I'll figure out what's important to me, what I'm really good at, and that's special to me. And everything else I will ally with, I will partner with, right? I will buy as a service, potentially. And I think that's what we're seeing in the larger arena. And it's not just security related, but across more aspects of the infrastructure.
And I think that in the case of security, though, we're dealing with a much higher complexity level, especially for those who are used to thinking network, not thinking security. And I think that's
Absolutely.
that my observation would be that's one of the other areas that I think is resulting in a lot of exploration of how organizations.
That's correct. And as Dave pointed out, when things get encrypted, then you have to look elsewhere, look higher layer, and you could get more intelligent. You have to turn to heuristics and AI in terms of the traffic patterns, right? And I think that is where some people, it's out of their league, right? It's basically, look, I'm used to putting little firewalls in there. I'm used to inspecting traffic. Now everything's TLS, can't look inside. Now I got to look at the patterns outside, or convince the larger ecosystem, I think as Dave indicated, to put metadata in place, right? And then the question is, do you trust that metadata? How do you trust the metadata? So there's all these layers, and it's just getting harder and harder. And at some point, you give up and you say, hey, service provider, help me, or MSSP, managed security service provider, help me, right? Or you turn to your vendors, right? Because internally, there's just no way to keep up.
Yeah, you definitely can't be everything for everybody, and it's just getting worse.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Agree. Our next question is going to be in an area that we've already touched upon, but I want to definitely spend some time and elaborate. And that is, as was suggested earlier, the MEF has introduced a series of new security projects over the past year that are driven by a vision to enable cloud connectivity. And since some of you are directly involved in these activities and others are watching these activities, I'd like you to share your assessment of the role of these projects in driving adoption for cloud-based managed security services, and also things that areas that maybe the standards committee needs to think a little bit more about. And Nico, as the co-editor of the Zero Trust Project, I think you're in a good position to at least start the discussion. So why don't you talk about what the Zero Trust Project is, and then maybe share your views on the role of that project and others into this broader security space.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think our concept of the Zero Trust project that we're working on Zero Trust has been out here for a decade, so it's the concept is nothing new. I think in the concept of standards and defining standards, this is a very much focused a project around SD-WAN and having sort of Zero Trust within SD-WAN as part of the larger scope of MEF's focus, as well as the SASE services, and there's a couple others as well. But the project is there to define a framework for Zero Trust within the context of SD-WAN, but also in a normal networking sort of construct as well. So that's where we started. In other working groups within MEF, again, very much focused on the SD-WAN space. I think that's the hot topic at the moment. We defined SD-WAN as a standard, and now looking at the application security for SD-WAN as another working group at the moment. There's a specifications testing, which you guys are very much involved in. How do we test these services? So we're defining these frameworks and these services in various forms, and how do we test and how do we conform to these standards once they're in? So that's another element as well. But I think that the role of standards is quite well defined. I mean, there's a fair amount of SDOs around, but I think the main thing is it's sort of brand new concepts, and your service providers, your carriers, your technologists are looking at these working projects not just from a point of view of what we're doing, but also a bit of guidance. It's very implementation agnostic, but there's still a lot of guidance involved here in saying, these elements form a decent security function, or these elements of this framework constitutes a Zero Trust environment, and what are the benefits, and just again guidance on these things without being dictators, I guess is another. It's all about defining a set standard, so which people can conform to, but also implement on their own. So I think that's sort of a high level where we are at the moment and sort of the roles we're playing.
Yeah, thank you for talking about that. The MEF also has a project to address security functions, which is another one, the first actual security project that was really focused more about SD-WAN. Roy, again, from the broad perspective, we know what's the role of standards in, as Nico pointed out, typically in telecommunications. Question here is that given that we have this convergence, or at least we have this collision between telecommunications and cloud, is that role changing now that we're seeing a different set of dynamics, a different set of stakeholders who are actually involved in driving managed security services that were not necessarily part of the overall networking ecosystem?
Yeah, I think going forward with convergence, I don't think there's going to be an easy distinction between what is the networking ecosystem, what's the cloud ecosystem, what's the application ecosystem. I think the reality is that, the worlds will converge and collide, right? And and I think the reality here is whatever security standards we put in place, whatever we work out, it needs to span more than just the network, right? And I think fundamentally, as we go forward, when you say the word network, it's going to be unlikely that the word security doesn't come with it, right? When you say access for the enterprise, by default, it should be secure access. There is no other access, generally speaking, going forward for enterprises that makes sense. And so I think, when we look at the MEF, when we look at other bodies that historically have stayed in the telco space, there are others bodies out there on the other side, on the cloud space, right, and on the infrastructure space, right, Cloud Security Alliance, for instance, and that's already started, right? I think that I wouldn't say merging, but at least that intertwining, that conversation between multiple parties for cloud application infrastructure, telcos, for security. Security needs to be end-to-end. Security needs to be top to bottom, multiple layers. I think the reality is we're going to see that more and more.
And Devesh, I'm going to go to you next. And as the co-chair of the MEF Test and Certification Committee, I'm curious if you could share your thoughts on not only how these standards are being developed, but what is the role of test and certification in this whole emergence of new security standards?
You're on mute, Devesh.
Sorry. Okay, what I was going to say is
2020 saying of the year.
the test and validation process in any deployment, be it on cloud, be it on premise or on a networking, these days it has to go hand in hand with the enterprise's cloud migration strategy. So if you're migrating your applications into cloud, you need to have your test and validation tightly intertwined with that process, because that's where you're changing your current setup to something which is going on cloud. And maybe part of it still remains on premise. So you might have a hybrid environment also, right? So, I mean, typically, if you look at what are the tests and certification that are done during this process, you may have a load and stress test done. You may have performance testing that is to be done on an application which is moving to a cloud. In terms of security, you will have a vulnerability testing, or you would have security testing per se for applications. So those are part and parcel of a deployment that would go into the cloud. From a MEF perspective, I think what we're looking at is first of all, I think the test and validation committee is working hand in hand with the LSO and the digital services committee, because that's where you are forming standards, right? You're forming standards for SD-WAN, you're forming standards for any new service, zero trust and all that. So you work with them hand in hand. And I'm mentioning that for the purpose of the larger audience that we have, we may not be very familiar with MEF. So what happens is, after you have that actual standard come up, you would have a test requirements document that is contributed together in the test and validation committee, which forms the basis of actually creating a test standard. So like that's what was done with SD-WAN and previously with the Carrier Ethernet services. And going on, it would become part and parcel for the newer validations or test certification that come out of MEF. Security is one of them. So two key aspects I would like to talk about. which are very much part of MEF projects today, and they are being contributed by fellow service providers as well as technology providers. One is in the space of LSO endpoint security. So in the context of APIs, how do we secure those? How do we make sure that anyone accessing a service provider as a buyer or a seller is assured that their APIs are secure, that they don't malfunction, that there is no security breach? Because as opposed to someone using a web console and requesting for service, APIs can be triggered through machine. It can have thousands of hits in a second, and you have to have specific control mechanisms. You need to understand who's accessing, what are they accessing. So there is a project going on in MEF where you're addressing the endpoint security per se. There are standards available out there. A lot of them, just to name a few: OAuth authentication, JWT tokens, and the lot. And how to standardize them and how to bring them along with the API specs. That is the process that MEF is actually currently embarking on, because they are in the initial definition that's very loosely defined, and it's open to interpretation by every service provider as to what and how do you implement it. Okay, so the what and the how is now coming in that project. And the second one, which I think, Mark, you just alluded to, is the application flow security, which is mainly tightly tightened with the SD-WAN offering. And why is that? Because SD-WAN, everyone knows, the underlay can be anything. It may be a trusted MPLS-based underlay where you have security ingrained, you have private addressing and all that. But you also have a public environment where your underlay is just pure public internet. And so there, in those scenarios where you are actually drafting your ingress outgress policies within the SD-WAN context, it is paramount that we also add security features there, because that's where you would enforce them. And so to have a separate console just for security doesn't really make sense. It has to come together. So those are the two significant projects which are being worked upon in MEF. And Test and Validation Committee is actually working together with other tools to form standards. It might take some time. But another thing I would like to bring in here is, this is not a one-time exercise. The standards that are being set up and the certification process, it's an ongoing thing. So the standards would evolve, and so would the certification and test processes. They would evolve. So I think in our forum, what we are broad guideline is like that if you have a service certification, it undergoes an overhaul, and you get a new set of certs defined every 12 to 18 months. It's a long-term process, because you need to take into consideration that there are standards that are being formed, and then you run a validation certification on top of that. On the API world, it's a much faster world. So you can expect actually standards and certifications coming every 6 months down the line. So that work is ongoing in MEF, and I think we're all part of that right now.
Devesh, thank you. And there is no doubt that one of the challenges, I think, that not just the MEF, but the standards community is facing is, how do you even create standards like this? This is very different than some of the other standardization that we've been involved in the context of managed services. But now, Dave, I want to go to you. Now, we've laid out in the first, at least Nico and Roy and Devesh have talked about the standards, or in other words, the theory of standards. But you're at a position in the market where you need to deal with the reality of standards. So do you want to talk about your organization's response to how we're addressing these new standards and how we are going to be able to validate these in a systematic way?
Well, I mean, the first response I have is that it's necessary that we have a community-driven approach to setting the baseline by which things are going to be measured. Let's face it, the vendor community will do whatever is in its best interests to some degree, and we need an environment that's going to referee that in a way that allows a standardized, certificate-based way of saying that a particular technology meets the bare minimum or more for what its value proposition is to either an enterprise or an operator that's going to use and offer that technology as a managed service. I look at the past, and I've been around for a long time, and I sort of grew my career as a technical marketing person using test equipment to validate Ethernet equipment, either in the data center switching realm or in the edge router realm. And we had a wonderful thing is in the backdrop was the IETF RFC 2544, which was a mechanism that allowed us to test this technology. Now, I remember at the time that the developers of that technology, so I was a marketing guy trying to break things, my own equipment and my competitors' equipment. The developers used to come to me and say, well, why am I testing everything as a full mesh at 64 bytes? That's absurd. And 64 bytes like that will never happen on a network. Well, the reason that we tested it is, number one, because we could, but number two, because it was an edge condition that was likely to break some of the forwarding mechanisms that existed in that environment. And so we tested to the edges of theoretical reasoning in order to find problems, in order to achieve some form of interoperability and, frankly, commodity behavior in the Ethernet realm. And guess what? Over a period of about 5 or 6 to 10 years, we did that. And now everything interoperates quite well. There are still some, sort of protocol things that have some fuzziness in them. But the thing that we're missing today in the security realm is something similar, a standard that will allow us to hold the developers of the equipment or the offerers of service accountable, but also to be able to test, right? To have a backdrop which they can understand the thing that they're building or the service they're offering, how it will behave on behalf of the enterprise, so that, going back to the comments that were made earlier on the economic model, that it can be right-sized and that it can be adopted and that people can make decisions. And how do I choose between one thing and another? So for me, it's absolutely mandatory that an independent body comprised of the various stakeholders in the vendor, enterprise, operator community get together and decide what good looks like. And that we are able to work with each other in a collegial way to define that that's not controversial. And I think the MEF has done a great job, starting with SD-WAN, looking at SASE, looking at Zero Trust. These are areas that are going to evolve. And as Devesh said, this is not going to be something that ends. This is going to go on and on and on, because this technology landscape is evolving incredibly rapidly. Use the example of SASE, right? If you look at SASE as defined, and you could argue with the definition, you can see a whole host of traditional security realm vendors converging on that, but they come with different strengths. So you look at the secure web gateway folks, you look at the Zero Trust network access folks, you look at the next gen firewall folks, and then you look at SD-WAN. They all have distinctive capabilities that actually read on the hoped for benefit in SASE, and they're going to try to use their strengths to win in the market. Absent a backdrop with which to compare that convergence and to find things that actually matter to a particular set of enterprise applications or a particular set of operator needs, it's difficult for people to make decisions. So I'm thankful to be participating with the MEF's advocacy and effort to try to build this out as a place that people can use as a reference point. It's absolutely mandatory that we have one if we're going to succeed, particularly with the amount of evolution that's taking place.
No, thank you. We only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to give everybody one last chance to leave something with our audience, which is, what is the one thing that you're recommending that our audience should be thinking about in managed security services over the next 12 to 18 months? Just one point. We only have a few minutes, so everybody has to be pretty brief. Roy, I'll start with you. And what's the one thing everybody should be thinking about after they leave this panel session?
So I think from the enterprise's standpoint, I think, it's consider managed security as an option. If you're not already, I think that's only straightforward. And from carriers or other providers, I think, look for ways to partner or develop those capabilities, because they will be asked for and they will be needed. And the reality is managed security is going to be a multi-layer problem. And so you will have to develop likely DNA that you don't already have, from the underlying infrastructure in embedded IoT, especially as a carrier, all the way up to the application stacks, running on top of clouds. And if you don't understand what shift left is in security in the cloud, then it's time to get educated.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to ask everybody to be really brief because the clock is ticking away. Nico, what's the one thing that you'd like everybody to think about for the next 12 to 18 months?
Sorry, I think security needs to be baked into your network. So the first element, I think, is going to be look at SD-WAN. There is a lot of work going and building security into your network from an enterprise point of view. And the second thing is have a look at SASE. I think the convergence of network and security functions, cloud native is going to be the way to go in the future for sure.
Okay, thank you. And that was two, by the way. Devesh, what's the one thing we should be thinking about looking ahead?
Well, I'd like to go with actually what Nico just mentioned. I think I want to echo that the network and security, they're converging. So you need to, I would say that the message out there to the enterprises there is to outsource that and to outsource it to MSPs, which can actually give you both a managed security service end to end, including maybe an on-demand REM on something with SD-WAN and security credentials all built into one. So if there is a carrier provider who has good repute with both of these services, would be the right pick for those services.
Thank you. And Dave.
Yeah, it's very simple. Trust, but verify. We're talking about zero trust. That doesn't mean you don't have to trust. You do. You have to understand what it is that you're using. And the only way you can do that is to force verification, independent validation of the claims of vendors or operators in order to know that the thing that you're contracting for or paying for meets the needs that it expresses that it will.
All right, thank you. And I would agree that where we are today with security, this convergence we've been alluding to, that we've been discussing throughout the event, if you look at the program and some of the talks that you might not be able to cover, this is going to be definitely the thing I would recommend from my perspective. So in winding things down, I first wanted to please join me as the audience in thanking the panelists for their insights, for the time they took, their preparation, and the thoughts that they're sharing on a really critical topic as we move toward the cloud. And we also wanted to thank the audience for you for expending your time on this particular session, which we appreciate. Don't hesitate to send your questions. Layer123 can provide the email information, and we will respond by email. And the final thought is that we want you to enjoy the rest of the event. We know it's winding down. It's the final day, but we hope to see everyone at next year's event, hopefully live in The Hague, like we missed this year. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.